First, I'm going to be looking at the approaches section. So what was in the 2018 paper for this section? You've got Wundt, parts of the endocrine system and functions of these parts, Pavlov, so this is the behaviourism approach, and then there were a few research method questions as well. What do I think could come up in the 2019 paper for this section? You've got the cognitive approach, so that's your internal mental processes and then inferences that are made, the theoretical and computer models, and then that focus on cognitive neuroscience, which we haven't really seen in the past, so that's why I've popped that on here. I do think that could definitely come up here. And then of course here you've also got the role of the schema. Next, you've got the biological approach. I think there's a good chance this one will be a 12-mark question. Within the biological approach, you've of course got your genes, the nervous system, your difference between genotype and phenotype, and this is a key one to know, and then evolution with that focus on natural selection. And as you can see here, I've put on evolution on the screen because I think that is one that could come up because we haven't really seen it so much before. Next, you've got biopsychology. So the parts I think are most likely to come up within this section are your sensory, relay and motor neurons, that idea of excitation and inhibition, that idea of summation, your process of synaptic transmission, which is the kind of thing that could come up every year but worded slightly differently, so you've got to look out for that. And then your fight or flight system, which is of course when you're in your sympathetic state. And then, as I've put here further down, the role of adrenaline. I think this is quite a key one. I do think it hasn't really come up before, so there could just be a smaller question on it. Just so, as long as you know what adrenaline does, you'll be absolutely fine. And then finally, you've got the social learning theory. Whilst this has come up in parts before, it hasn't come up too much recently, as in the last paper, so I do think there could be a smaller mark question on this one. So one thing to note with this section is that it is a very repetitive section in that in the past papers a lot of the topics do seem to come up every year, so your biopsychology is just one example of that, so I wouldn't miss anything out on that, but again those in red, so the cognitive and biological approach, are the ones I do think are most likely to come up as your longer mark questions. Psychopathology. So what was in the 2018 paper for this section? There are a few questions on the characteristics of phobias. There was a question on OCD, and then also a question on the explanation of depression. So what do I think could come up in the 2019 paper for this section? You've got your explanation of phobias, so that's your two-process model with classical and operant conditioning. I think this one is most likely to be your 12 marker. Next, you've got your explanation of OCD. So this is of course your genetic explanations being those candidate genes, the fact that OCD is polygenic, different types of OCD, and then your neural explanations of the serotonin and then your decision-making systems. Because of the presence of this topic in the past, I do think this will be a smaller mark question. Next, I've just put on here about psychology and the economy. So this has only really come up once before with that psychology and the link with depression. So for this you can kind of talk about those days off work, losing money within the economy, that kind of thing. You should know some points for that. Make sure you have that down. You've also got your characteristics of OCD and depression. So last year it was of phobias, so this year it could easily be of one of the other two. So this is just your emotional, behavioural and cognitive characteristics. And then finally you've got your different definitions of abnormality. So this is your deviation from ideal mental health, failure to function adequately, statistical infrequency, and then deviation from social norms. Again, this is the kind of one that we have seen quite a few times before, but it's not stopping that coming up again, perhaps as a smaller mark question, maybe asking you to just talk about two, just one, comparing two different explanations. We just don't know. And finally, we've got research methods. So what was in the 2018 paper for this section? You had your questions on the matched pairs design, controlling of variables, random allocation, stratified sample, qualitative data, ethical issues, to draw a scattergram, a question on descriptive statistics, and then the skew of data. What do I think could come up in the 2019 paper for this section? You've got pilot studies, Planning your own study. So with this, you just need to make sure you account for all the variables. You may have to write your own hypothesis and aim and procedure, depending on what it is. You're typically given a scenario and then you just have to go through and identify everything. This kind of question is usually worth 12 marks and it does cover quite a bit. So it is a good one that they like to do. You've also got the idea of peer review. You've also got your mathematical content. So of course working out your mean, median, mode, percentages. This is the kind of thing that comes up on every paper, so never rule this one out. Construction of a graph. So last year it was that scattergram, so it could be a bar chart this year. It could be either or, could be a table, you never know. You've also got your experimental design. So this is your repeated measures, independent groups, etc. So last year we of course had repeated measures, so it may not be that one this year. And just make sure you know your advantages and disadvantages of each of those types. You may also be required to write a hypothesis and perhaps an aim, as well as comparing what both of these are and writing the difference, so make sure you're clear on that. You've also got your measures of dispersion and central tendency, so as long as you know the difference between those two, you'll be absolutely fine. You've also got your observational design, so this is looking at those behavioural categories, time sampling and event sampling. So with this, you could be given a scenario and then be asked to identify different behavioural categories and then how researchers will carry out their analysis using these behavioural categories. You've also got that idea of counterbalancing. And finally, there may be a question asking you to explain what a meta-analysis actually is. This hasn't really been asked before, so as long as you know that a meta-analysis is where researchers take a lot of different studies and go through everything, their findings, comparing everything, then you'll be fine. So one you should know for this is that Van Dorn and Kroonenberg meta-analysis. So just reference that. With all of that being said, I just wanted to say a huge good luck to all of you, and I'd also like to point out, if you have any topics that you're not so keen on and you need some extra help with, just let me know and I can make any videos for you. So for example, if you'd like to know how to carry out a sign test, just let me know in the comments and I can do anything like that for you. So again, good luck everyone, and of course, don't just revise what I've said to, make sure you have a look over everything.